Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 39A, an interview on Jimmy Carter, the Outsider, with Jonathan Alter. I'm excited to welcome Jonathan Alter to the show today. Jonathan is a top-flight journalist and a best-selling author of numerous books about the presidency, including his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, a fantastic read that I encourage you to check out. You might also recognize him from his appearances as a political analyst on MSNBC. Today, Jonathan and I are going to discuss the double-edged sword that was Carter's outsider nature. It may be what got him elected in 76, and it may be what got him unelected 4 years later. Thank you for your time, Jonathan.
My pleasure, Kenny.
Let's start with what inspired your interest in Jimmy Carter?
You know, when I was 20 years old, I was an intern in Jimmy Carter's White House when I was a college student. I was in the speechwriting office.
No kidding.
And so I got to know some of the Carter people, 3 or 4 of whom have stayed as very good friends over the years. But I did not become a Carter fan, actually, at that point. In fact, a couple of years later, when I was just out of college, I was a volunteer on Ted Kennedy's campaign, which was one of the dumber things I've ever done because it made no sense for Kennedy to challenge a sitting Democratic president just because he wasn't quite as liberal as Kennedy. It wasn't really a good enough reason. And Kennedy felt kind of entitled to run that year. And I think it was a mistake, especially his decision to stay in all the way to the 1980 convention. But so I experienced that. And then I didn't really have much interaction with Jimmy Carter when I was a Newsweek columnist, except in 2000 when I went out and interviewed him on a Habitat for Humanity site in New York about the Middle East. It was right around the time that Bill Clinton was leaving office, and he had tried to engineer a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It was a very, very good offer for the Palestinians, which Yasser Arafat rejected. And I remember talking to Carter about that, and Carter basically telling me for Newsweek that Arafat would have been assassinated if he had accepted that deal, probably by Hamas, you know?
Yeah, it's possible.
And then, you know, I didn't really think that much about Jimmy Carter until early 2015, when in a book group that I'm in New York City, we were reading a book about Camp David, the Camp David Accords, which I devote a fair amount of attention to in my book.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Carter, his grandson, Jason, who had just run for governor of Georgia and lost narrowly, his campaign manager, or one of his advisors, was in my book group. So this guy brought Jason and Jimmy Carter, and we spent an evening with at that time, he was a 90-year-old former American president. And he was so smart and so convincing on a number of different subjects that I thought to myself afterwards, there has to be more to this guy than crappy president, great former president, which is the shorthand that you can hear walking out into the street. And then by very happy coincidence, my editor at Simon & Schuster, the late Alice Mayhew, who was one of the legendary nonfiction editors, edited Doris Kearns Goodwin and Woodward and Bernstein and a lot of other people, Taylor Branch. She was Jimmy Carter's editor on his more recent books. And writing books is the way he has supported himself all these years out of office. And so Alice was able to smooth my way, and I got a tremendous amount of access to Jimmy Carter and his entire family. And then I interviewed another 250 people as part of preparing this book.
So Jimmy Carter, first off, that's a fantastic effort. Really cool. Thanks for sharing. Jimmy Carter is one of the true dark horse candidates in American presidential history. If I
Correct.
recall, some early presidential polls didn't even list him as an option going into an election. He ultimately won. So, what made Carter think he could become president when he was just, a governor in Georgia? When did this idea take hold?
So the idea really took hold not when he was a boy. His childhood ambition was to be an admiral in the Navy
Hmm.
or chief of naval operations eventually. And and then, I think he really, after he went to the Georgia State Senate in 1962, he had his sights set on being governor of Georgia, and he achieved that after running unsuccessfully
Mm-hmm.
in 1966. He was elected in 1970, and when you're governor of a fairly significant state, uh, politicians come through, and all of
Mm-hmm.
the 1972 candidates came through in 1971 and 72. And Carter kind of took their measure. These were very prominent senators like Edmund Muskie and
Mm-hmm.
George McGovern, who ended up getting the nomination. Later, Ted Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey came. And he didn't really think that they were any smarter than he was. And he actually thought that even though they were all a lot more famous, that he knew more about government. He's never lacked for self confidence, and
Mm-hmm.
that governors rather than senators really
Mm-hmm.
understood what was involved in being president, except for on foreign policy. So he was fortunate enough to join something called the Trilateral Commission,
Mm-hmm.
and he met a lot of important foreign policy types from around the world when he was governor.
Hmm.
He traveled to what he calls the Holy Land, the Middle East,
Right.
when he was governor, and he educated himself on foreign policy to the point where he became arguably, with the possible exception of Joe Biden, best informed president on foreign policy that
Hmm.
we've had. And so then the idea kind of took root. Well, maybe I could do this. And he actually decided on the night that Nixon was reelected in 1972 in a huge landslide.
Yeah.
The next day, he and his people who thought that he would be a good candidate were already talking about a secret campaign, really, for the presidency. And he knew that if the word got out that that people would minimize his chances. And
Hmm.
indeed, when the word did get out, there was a prominent columnist in the Atlanta Constitution who wrote a column. Jimmy Carter is running for what? You know, and his own mother said, president of what? A university? Like it was a very strange notion to people, but he felt like he could. And then when the Watergate scandal
Mm.
unfolded the
Mhm.
following year in 1973, then he became the perfect antidote to Watergate. And it was one of these man meets moment situations where people were ready for a clean sweep and tired of the Washington politicians who had gotten us into Watergate. And so Carter, with his promise, I'll never lie to you, I want a government as good as its people, it was perfectly positioned after Watergate. But it was still a long shot,
Yeah.
and he
Yeah.
made some very smart decisions. For instance, betting on the Iowa caucuses, which in those days was a nothing event, and he turned it into a big deal. And also, he was a brilliant retail campaigner.
Hmm.
He was really, really good in small groups, not so good on television, but perfectly suited to Iowa and New Hampshire. And he won both of them.
So he sees this as a real opportunity because of the distaste of Washington politicians that maybe he can become the first non incumbent Southerner elected president since before the Civil War. running on this outsider, I won't lie to you plan. Can you elaborate on was there anything more to the plan? Was it as simple as like Iowa or bust? What were some of the elements that he brought in to make sure that his message got out and resonated with people?
Well, it wasn't Iowa or bust, but it was very important in executing the campaign strategy that was laid out by his young, brilliant aide, Hamilton Jordan. Iowa and New Hampshire were central. And then the other thing that was very important for him was to beat George Wallace. And so
Mm-hmm.
he was positioning himself as the candidate of the New South. And even though he hadn't been part of the civil rights movement
Right.
and in some ways had run a kind of a dog whistle campaign for governor in 1970, he wasn't explicitly racist, but he got elected governor with the help of racists and segregationists.
Right.
And he would, at that time, he was actually saying nice things about Wallace as a way
Right.
of getting votes for governor in 1970. But 6 years later, in 1976, Wallace, who had been wounded and paralyzed
Mm.
in 1972 and was campaigning from a wheelchair, was making another bid for the presidency. And he had, a fair amount of support. He had done well in 68 and 72.
Mm-hmm.
So the climactic primary was in Florida. And this was after Carter had had a couple of setbacks following Iowa and New Hampshire. And he campaigned in Florida and he was able to beat Wallace there. And that was not only essential to his getting the nomination, but it was the end of the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party, which had existed since the dawn of the Republic. Remember, the Democrats
Yeah.
were like our first real political party, and they were the party of the South. It's kind
Right.
of hard for us to imagine this now then, and so after 1976, after Carter beat Wallace, we only had one political party in this country that gave any kind of a permission slip to racists.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Democratic Party, it became the party of black voters who were very loyal to Jimmy Carter, even when others were
Mm.
deserting him. And this was all happening in 1976. And I think then the other factor, Kenny, that we haven't talked about is that Carter's intense religious faith
Yeah.
came through in that campaign. And that was very appealing to people. And he didn't, at first, he didn't really want to introduce it, but then the press kind of got onto it. And so he connected to people of faith. And he also ran as a moderate. So basically, all the other candidates were what we would now call progressive. They
Mm-hmm.
in those days they were more often called liberal. And Carter was unpredictable. He would be quite liberal on some issues
Mm-hmm.
and more conservative on other issues. And he was very skillful in the way he did that. And he'd had a lot of interesting life experiences. So he could talk to farmers because he was a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
He could talk to veterans because he was a veteran,
Mm-hmm.
been in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
He could talk to engineers because he was an engineer,
Mm-hmm.
people who were interested in science. And so he was able to kind of build a coalition, but it wasn't a true political coalition, which is what hurt him when he ran for reelection, is he didn't really have any hardcore Carter supporters who he could rely on outside of the black community. And this became a problem for him. He never really developed his own base because the base of the Democratic Party was still to the left of him, which is what caused him problems with Kennedy later on.
There's a comment in your book that Carter may have been the unluckiest president, but he was one of the luckiest campaigners. He had one of the luckiest campaigns. Can you give me some examples I think in your book you talk about how he was always the most liberal guy running in the South, the most conservative guy running in the North, or I guess you could
Right.
say moderate.
Yeah,
Can you
well,
elaborate on that?
that's pretty lucky. If
Yeah,
he's the liberal against Wallace in the South and the moderate to conservative against Mo Udall, who kept finishing second in primaries those years, a very amusing, uh, terrific congressman from Arizona, and Birch Bayh, who got knocked out early, Henry Scoop Jackson, who got knocked out fairly early. So Carter was, um, more moderate than them, although Jackson was pretty moderate. Jackson was just not a good candidate. Carter was a much more skillful campaigner. But generally speaking, what you said, the way you summarized it, and I did in the book, which
yeah,
is, he was always, the liberal alternative in the South, or the, moderate alternative in the South to the segregationist, and the moderate alternative to the liberals in the North. And he also just caught some breaks in key primaries. So in Wisconsin,
yeah.
it looked like Udall was going to stop him, and actually even on election night, on primary night, the local paper, the Milwaukee Journal, ran a headline: "Udall beats Carter." And Carter the next day held it, when he won by just a few votes. He held it up the way Harry Truman held up Dewey defeats Truman,
Hmm.
that famous picture. And that helped propel him. And then the other thing, that it was less luck than just having some of the right friends.
Hmm.
So Carter made some gaffes in that campaign. And the most serious one was in an interview. He talked about the ethnic purity, quote unquote,
Mm.
of neighborhoods, and it caused a real firestorm. But Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, who Carter had become very close to um, after he hung Martin Luther King Jr.'s portrait in
Right,
the Georgia State Capitol. And this was after having dodged Martin Luther King during his lifetime. Carter
right.
never met him, not once.
Wow.
And they were both, he was serving in Atlanta in the state Senate. King was from Atlanta, but Carter was too worried about being connected to King with, his very, very conservative state Senate constituency in Southwest Georgia. But he made up for it by becoming very tight with Coretta Scott King and
Mm.
Daddy King and Andy Young, who later was his UN ambassador. And so when he ran into trouble with this ethnic purity flap, um, the Atlanta members of the Black community, Atlanta leaders, they testified for him basically, and helped him out. And something, slightly different happened with the other big gaffe that he made in that campaign, and that was that when he said in an interview with Playboy magazine
Right.
that he had lust in his heart, which he was just explaining what every young Baptist boy from a observant family, um, uh, what they experienced when they were in Sunday school as kids. They were told, "Look, it's as much of a sin to lust in your heart as it is to actually, uh, you know, do it."
Hmm.
And Carter just mentioned that in this long, very, very
Mm.
compelling interview with Playboy. And it caused a huge storm in the fall of 1976 when he was running against Gerald Ford. And he dropped 10 points in the polls, and it looked
Wow.
as if he might lose to Ford. And in fact, it was a very, very close election. But again, in a stroke of luck, um, in one of their debates,
Right.
uh, Gerald Ford, who was the incumbent president, he had taken over from Nixon, as you know, he said that Eastern Europe was not under the domination of the Soviet Union. And this just dominated the headlines, and it took all the steam out of the Playboy story and
Mm-hmm.
changed the whole center of attention, negative attention to Gerald Ford.
So Carter, he's running on being an outsider who will not lie to you, and he really did seem to be a Democratic outsider in the sense that he was not the type of big government New Dealer Democrats had been electing since FDR. You hinted at this earlier.
Yeah.
What did Jimmy Carter think of the old Democratic solutions, and how was his domestic agenda going to be different?
So Carter is very difficult to pigeonhole politically, which was a source of both strength because it allowed him to appeal to a wider variety of voters,
Mm-hmm.
and also some weakness because when he would try to get bills through Congress, people couldn't get a read on where he was politically because he was zigging and zagging. I think he was much more like a Theodore Roosevelt progressive at the turn of the 20th century than a Franklin Roosevelt New Dealer. And in fact, his father had despised the New Deal
Mm-hmm.
after initially voting for Roosevelt. He got much more conservative because of the agriculture policies of the administration, where in order to raise prices, they made farmers slaughter a lot of their pigs to raise pork prices, and
Mm-hmm.
it was the first time they encouraged them not to grow crops.
Right.
And Earl Carter despised this. And even though Jimmy Carter worked briefly as a surveyor as a teenager for a New Deal program, and
Huh.
his father was a big supporter of the Rural Electrification Administration, which
Right.
was one of FDR's great accomplishments. Carter didn't really have the New Deal in his DNA. And he also, as an engineer, he didn't believe in received wisdom. He really was a non ideological
Hmm.
politician and didn't really even think of himself as a politician. So he saw himself as a problem solver, like an
Hmm.
engineer,
Yeah.
and that you could engineer the solutions to problems. And he did so very, very successfully. And I think even though, my bottom line on him as president is even though he was a political failure, he was a substantive and often visionary success and got a huge number of bills through Congress, which everybody has completely forgotten about, partly by kind of engineering a sensible solution in foreign policy as well. Now, a lot of other people don't really care what the right answer is. They want the political
Sure.
answer.
Sure.
And this made it hard sometimes for him to get along with other politicians, and he could also be snappish with them sometimes. And he failed on some big bills on tax reform and healthcare reform and a consumer protection administration that he wanted, which was very much in line with the kinds of things that Theodore Roosevelt wanted to do. So he was very focused in and succeeded in a number of areas in protecting consumers and making government work better, and in um, we could go down through the various policy achievements, but it was basically a center left, not a conventionally liberal perspective, especially on economic issues. So
Hmm.
people tend to think that it was Ronald Reagan who ended the ruinous inflation of the 1970s.
Right.
But it was actually Jimmy Carter who suffered the consequences in 1980. But it was Jimmy Carter who appointed Paul Volcker as the chair of the Federal Reserve. And that was quite a conservative pick. And because what did he do? He pursued a kind of a conservative approach of jacking up interest rates in order to apply very harsh medicine to end inflation. And Carter also cut the budget,
Hmm.
uh, and a lot of liberals really objected to that. And he would zero out programs or try to that weren't working, even though his budget cuts were very mild compared to Reagan's.
Mm-hmm.
They were objected to by liberals, and he disappointed people who thought he was going to be the continuation of LBJ. And so, because
Mm,
he was the first Democratic president since LBJ, and
yeah,
LBJ had this hugely ambitious domestic agenda.
yeah,
So all these people who thought that he was going to like revive the Great Society were severely
yeah.
disappointed. Even though he did do things like he did strengthen uh, certain Great Society programs like Social Security, and most arguably most important, he enacted 15 major pieces of energy and environment legislation. And he also just
Right, right,
on an ideological point where the two sides can kind of come together. Like right now, deregulation is seen as a kind of a dirty word, but Carter and Ted Kennedy combined for a lot of deregulation that was very much in the interest of consumers, like deregulating the trucking industry, deregulating the airline industry so that not all, but most airline fares would go down
hmm
significantly, and even deregulating some silly New Deal legislations, for instance, in the brewing of beer, just to use a tiny example, but one of many.
yeah,
So if it wasn't for Jimmy Carter, there would be no craft brewing industry
right.
because he deregulated the breweries.
Let's start unpacking some of the biggest elements of this domestic agenda. And before we go into it, let's kind of set the stage. In addition to winning the presidency, the Democrats also won a 61-37 majority in the Senate and a 292-143 majority in the House. No president has taken office with a larger majority since. So, what was Carter's relationship with this majority in Congress, especially some of the power groups he'd have to work with, like the Southern Caucus, or you mentioned Ted Kennedy several times?
And Tip O'Neill was the new Speaker of the House, and Robert Byrd was the majority leader of the Senate. So when I asked Carter what his biggest mistake was as president, I kind of thought that he would say, well, I let the Shah of Iran in for medical treatment, and that
Right, right,
precipitated the seizure of the hostages, but he didn't say that. And I thought maybe he would say firing his cabinet in the
right,
summer of half of his cabinet in the summer of 1979 after the famous malaise speech where he never actually used the word malaise, but
right,
the speech had been well received, and then he decided to ask for the resignations of his entire cabinet, and he accepted about half of them, and this caused a huge storm that hurt him. And he admitted that that was a mistake. But what he said was his biggest mistake was that he didn't manage his relationships within the Democratic Party.
mm,
And so it was really his job as president to make sure that Ted Kennedy stayed in the Democratic tent, and that was his job. And there was enough blame to go around. Like Ted Kennedy, it's not just that he ran against Carter. Um, he couldn't even get his own health care bill through his own committee, and yet he sabotaged Carter's bill, which was similar to Obamacare and would have done a lot of good over the next 30 years and saved a lot of people from personal bankruptcy for healthcare expenses. And Kennedy just couldn't take yes for an answer, even when other liberals were. So there was enough blame to go around in that. But a lot of it was Carter's fault. He could be very high handed in talking to members of Congress. He, kind of had to prove that he was the smartest guy in the room
mm,
sometimes, which a lot of them found very annoying.
mm-hmm,
A lot of them had been friends with Gerald Ford when he was
mm,
in the House of Representatives, and they didn't even really know Carter. And
mm-hmm.
Carter didn't spend a lot of time getting to know them. And, he would do things that would irritate them, like not always serve liquor at,
Right.
events. Um, and they were easily offended, and it started early. Like Tip O'Neill was offended that he didn't get the right inauguration tickets,
Mm,
and he was offended that Carter took one of his cronies and supposedly mistreated him
hmm.
in his government job. And so there were these little flaps that kept happening, which Carter didn't do a very good job of papering over. So even though they got a lot done together
Yeah.
with these big majorities, they actually got more bills passed in 4 years than either Clinton or Obama did in 8 years, because
Right.
they only had a Democratic Congress for part of the time they were in office.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that people need to understand about this, they go, oh, he had 61 votes. It was like a filibuster proof. That's a total misreading of what the politics of the 1970s were.
Right.
You had a lot of Southern conservative Democrats
Right.
who voted conservative. And then you had some Northern liberal Republicans who would vote with Carter. And he had to put together a new coalition on every bill.
Right.
And so the level of party discipline that we see now was really not present, and only tells you so much about what Carter could do. And so, for instance, the Panama Canal treaties, which was one of the heaviest
Yes.
lifts, you need 2/3 for the approval of a treaty, and this was an enormously important treaty that prevented an ongoing war in Central America. We would probably still have troops in Panama if these deals hadn't gone through, because huge artery of global commerce.
Hmm.
The canal was in danger of being sabotaged. In order to prevent that, we would have had to have troops if we hadn't turned it over. But Reagan at that time was beginning to, become popular by arguing against the Panama Canal. It's ours. We paid for it. We're not handing it over. And 2/3 of the country was against it, and yet it needed a 2/3 vote
Right.
in the Senate for approval. And Carter somehow was able to get this. And it wasn't just because he had a Democratic majority. In
Right.
fact, a number of Democrats voted against it, or if they voted for it, they lost their seats for voting for it.
Hmm.
So it was a very brave vote for a number of Democrats. And then there were some enlightened Republicans like Howard Baker, the Senate Minority Leader, who went down to Panama, and he consulted with Carter. And even though he knew it was going to hurt him, he came out for the treaty, which was extremely important to its passage. So things were a lot more bipartisan in those days.
You've mentioned a couple times that Carter was ahead of his time on the environment, but it strikes me that this is one of the things that also got him in trouble with Congress. Can you talk me through the showdown over dams and how it impacted his relationship with Congress pretty early on?
Yeah, so this was not Carter's finest hour. So he canceled a bunch of water projects, dams and other water projects. And he didn't even really say he was doing it for environmental reasons. It was more because they were wasteful
Mm-hmm.
and unnecessary. And he had been, against some dams in Georgia when he was governor, and, did a lot to protect rivers from damming in Georgia. And thought that the fix was in on these dams, that, it was a combination of local interests and the Army Corps of Engineers and congressmen who wanted to bring home the bacon. And so they would waste a lot of government money on unnecessary dams. But he didn't handle it at all right. He pissed off a bunch of Democratic members of Congress early in his term by canceling these water projects. And it was an example of his kind of ham-handedness on certain political issues. And in some cases, he didn't even cancel the right dams. Like Gary Hart said, well, he
Oh
could have
gosh.
canceled some other Colorado dams, but he didn't cancel the right ones. And yeah, that was an example of how he alienated some people on the Hill. But, you know, politicians need to be judged differently in the present than they are by history. So, as a journalist, I judge a politician by how he does politically. And I think Jimmy Carter's reputation is very much um, conditioned by that journalistic take. And, he got a terrible press. I mean, as his press secretary, Jody Powell, said, we not only didn't get a honeymoon, we didn't get a one night stand from the press.
That's awesome.
And so, people are constantly reporting how he's failing politically. And that is conditioned, people's assumptions. Oh, he didn't get along with Congress because he didn't have a warm and fuzzy relationship with Tip O'Neill. Historians have a different mission than journalists. And when I put on my historian hat and take off my journalist hat,
Yeah.
I need to judge Jimmy Carter by how he changed the country in the long run.
Sure.
And that's not really about water projects or certain political failures that he had. It's like, what were the long-term effects of his policies? And a lot of them that nobody paid any attention to at the time, because there would be bill signings almost every week in the Rose Garden of the White House, inside the White House, are things that condition so much of our lives now. For instance, the first bill that incentivized public utilities to use clean energy. They weren't before that.
Yeah.
It was called the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. And I asked some really well-informed journalists, really smart, substantive journalists from that time, do you remember this bill? None of them could even remember the bill.
Right, yeah.
Think about what our life would be. All they could remember were the bills that didn't succeed. Think about Carter got about 80% of what he wanted. And, but because the energy bill went through in pieces and was very controversial, things like the decontrol of natural gas, which Northern liberals hated, because in order to incentivize more domestic energy production, because we were, OPEC and the Arabs had us over a barrel, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Carter decontrolled natural gas. It worked, but it would also send the price of home heating oil in the North up. So it was hugely controversial politically. And then other things were, controversial on the right. A lot of these environmental regulations that he had, strengthening the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and a whole series of other, creating the first toxic waste cleanup,
right.
Putting more pressure on polluters. These things were controversial with conservatives, where decontrol of natural gas, controversial with liberals. Not all of the energy ideas were good ones. So he did some synthetic fuels, which was, and doesn't hold up very well in retrospect. Arguably wasted a fair amount of money on that, on synthetic fuels. But other things, he was very, very farsighted. And I think people remember that he put solar panels on the roof of the White House, which Ronald Reagan took down.
Yep.
Now you could say, well, that's just symbolic, but actually Carter got legislation through that promoted solar energy.
Right.
And, there were a whole series of things. And then at the end of his time in office, he even was indicating that he was going to take global warming seriously. And he wanted electric cars by the mid-'80s if he had been reelected. So you can imagine what that would have been like.
Yeah.
And it lends a kind of a tragic dimension to that 1980 election, because very late in his presidency, something called the Council on Environmental Quality inside the White House issued an important paper on climate change, which was on page A13 of the New York Times. Didn't get much attention. Carter was the first leader anywhere in the world to take the problem seriously. And the recommendations on carbon emissions that he approved in 1980 were identical to the 2015 Paris
Wow.
Climate Accord standards in terms of the reductions that would be necessary to get a hold of this climate change problem.
So a lot of visionary policy that he got through. One that you mentioned in passing earlier was the cuts he did to the federal bureaucracy. I'd love to dial more into that. I'm curious what motivated that. How did that kind of compare to the Reagan cuts, which you mentioned were so much steeper, and what was the long term success of Carter's impact here?
Well, the budget cuts were sort of, temporary, and they were much, much deeper under Ronald Reagan, and in some cases, Reagan, gutted Carter programs. For instance, Rosalind Carter's great achievement was the first major mental health legislation we'd ever had in this
Hmm.
country, which passed in 1980 and set up a series of mental health clinics to deal with the homeless, mentally ill, and a whole series of other things to destigmatize mental illness and
Mhm.
fund treatment programs. And Reagan, when he got in, he cut everything from that. So it wasn't until Obamacare that we got some of those provisions that the Carters had initially gotten done. Carter's main contribution on the federal bureaucracy was actually to consolidate certain functions in the new Department of Energy. These were functions that had been spread across several agencies. And he created a new Department of Education. Uh, and, I don't think either of them are historically all that significant. Maybe more important was that he enacted the first civil service reform in the 100 years since the establishment of the civil service under Chester Arthur. And this did a lot to, for instance, this establishment of something called the Senior Executive Service was a very, very important way of maintaining institutional memory in the federal bureaucracy and
Hmm.
incentivizing more experienced people to stay in government. And he also made it, he streamlined uh, a lot of the bureaucracy and enacted legislation to reduce paperwork, which in any bureaucracy is a problem, although they don't call it paperwork anymore.
What do you think is the domestic achievement Carter is most proud of, and the domestic miss he most regrets?
Um, I'd say most proud of on the domestic side, I think would be his farsightedness on the environment.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so it wasn't just one bill, it was many bills. And, you know, um, almost all of them hold up really well. I mean, the Superfund, just to take one example, it's not that he singled that out, but, you know, it had a lot of problems early on, but it's cleaned up a hell of a lot of toxic waste dumps around the
Yeah.
country.
Yeah.
So I'd say that the environment would be probably his favorite domestic achievement. I think the thing that he probably regrets most is that they didn't get it done on healthcare. I think he
Mhm.
also regrets not getting it done on tax reform, but
Mhm.
healthcare was the big one domestically that got away. But he was much more focused on foreign policy
Yeah.
and spent much more of his time on foreign policy.
There's a quote about Carter that I think really says a lot. It's Jimmy Carter was someone you liked in 10 minutes, hated in 10 months, and understood in 10 years. It's been more than 10 years now. So, why did Carter's presidency and his relationship with Congress play out the way it did?
Well, I think there were mistakes on both sides, and Carter can be a prickly personality, and he didn't um, manage those relationships, as I mentioned. And on the other side, uh, Democrats took Democratic majorities and victories in presidential elections for granted,
Mm.
and they didn't realize that they had a pretty damn good president for all of his flaws, and that it was stupid to weaken him with the Kennedy challenge and an awful lot of carping, not just to each other, but to the Washington Post. They dumped on him a
Yeah.
lot, and I think they didn't take the longer view. Now you have somebody like George Miller, who was a very important House committee chair from California, who retired fairly recently, and he told me that Jimmy Carter was the best president he served under and
Hmm.
got the most done.
What lasting impact and legacy did Carter leave on the presidency?
Well, Kenny, we haven't talked about foreign policy. Yeah, I mean this is where his um, real achievements become clear, and so he in some sense failed on Iran, and I'm critical of him early on. I don't think he could have prevented the Iranian Revolution. I
Yeah.
think that's a
Yeah.
kind of does not hold up under scrutiny. But he let himself get held hostage by the Ayatollah Khomeini. It wasn't just the hostages who were hostages. Jimmy Carter was essentially a hostage.
Yeah.
And, that crisis came to dominate his presidency, and it went on for 444 days. Now, he would say with some credit, with some validity, that the hostages all came home alive.
Yeah.
So he doesn't think the whole thing was a failure, and he negotiated their release
Yeah.
just moments, literally minutes before he left the presidency on January 20th, 1981. But you have to put Iran in the negative category. But pretty much everything else came up aces in terms of the historical record for Jimmy Carter. And, I mentioned the Panama Canal treaties.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff said that the approval of those treaties prevented a major war in Central America. But they did more than that. They created tremendous goodwill
Yeah.
throughout Latin America. And that goodwill allowed Carter to introduce his human rights policy. And so Latin America went from being overwhelmingly dominated by dictators to being overwhelmingly democratic in the years after Carter left his presidency. Jimmy Carter doesn't deserve all the credit for it, but that human rights policy had a huge impact in Latin America. And when Carter was president, there was only one democracy in Latin America, and that was in Venezuela. And now in South America, there's only one dictatorship, and that's Venezuela. All democratic. And and then that human rights policy had enormous downstream benefits, and many conservative analysts and historians have acknowledged this, in hastening the end of the Cold War. Václav Havel gave interviews about how important Jimmy Carter's human rights policy was, and it, giving support to Soviet dissidents was extremely important in hollowing out the Soviet Union. And I think historians are just beginning to catch up to this, but or look at a country like South Korea, where Kim Dae-jung was held, he was in prison, he was under a death sentence at the time Carter was president. And later, Carter's Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Patricia Darien, she went when he was inaugurated as president of South Korea, and he said, if it wasn't for you and your boss, not only would I not be president of South Korea, but I wouldn't be alive. And those kinds of examples extend throughout his record on human rights. Normalizing relations with China, a huge accomplishment. Jimmy Carter himself told me that he thought that would be his longest lasting accomplishment. So Richard Nixon opened the door to China.
Right.
It was Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping who walked through the door.
Hmm.
And you got to remember, at the time of normalization, China had a GDP of a sub-Saharan African country. Moments after he returns from Washington, after signing this deal with Carter, Deng Xiaoping legalizes private property.
Oh,
Now
wow.
imagine, look at what's happened in China since then.
Yeah.
It's not only the greatest economic growth in human history by many multiples, but it's essentially the bilateral relationship with the United States is the foundation of the global economy. And for everything that China
Mm-hmm.
has done wrong,
Mm-hmm.
there are millions of American jobs that are connected to U.S.-China trade, even when there's tariffs. Doesn't matter what the situation is. There's still millions of those jobs, and it also helped keep the peace, because when you have relations,
Yes. Yeah.
and no matter how tense things get, at least you have diplomatic relations that are normalized. So, and then we haven't talked about Camp David,
Right.
the most durable major peace treaty since World War II. I think we're getting a sense today
Yeah.
of how significant it is, as the Egyptians threaten for the first time since 1978 to back out of parts of their deal with Israel.
Oh.
And imagine how horrible that would be.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine how horrible it would be right now if Egypt was prepared to use its army against Israel. So
Right.
they had fought 4 wars in 30 years when they got together at Camp David, and Israel and Egypt. And they haven't had a shot fired in
Mm-hmm.
anger in the 46 years since.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so this is a major achievement, which, by the way, both Begin and Sadat attributed to Jimmy Carter, even though they were the ones who got the Nobel Prize at the time, and Carter had to wait for his. Camp David was huge. And,
Yes. Yeah.
if the peace process gets going again, it will be built on Camp David in the same way that Oslo was. And for Israelis and American Jews who, are, they still know that, Carter was the most pro-Palestinian president in American history. What I would say to them is that's true.
Yeah.
And you can fault him for some of that. And I'm kind of critical of some of his freelance foreign policy when he was a former president.
Yeah.
But at the same time, by taking the Egyptian army off the table as a threat to Israel, Jimmy Carter was the best president for the security of the state of Israel since Harry Truman recognized Israel in 1948.
If you enjoyed this interview with Jonathan and want to learn more about Carter, please pick up his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, from a bookstore near you. You can also find his Substack, Old Goats, online. He puts columns out there on a regular basis. Thank you for your time, Jonathan.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. It helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you to everyone who has contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we will take a break from Carter for an interview that relates to the present. We've all heard that lame duck presidents tend to be less effective because everyone knows that their time in power is nearing its end. But are they truly less effective? Or are they just taking bigger gambles, chasing larger goals where the odds of success were always smaller? NYU economist William Silber discusses his new book, The Power of Nothing to Lose, the Hail Mary Effect in Politics, War, and Business, next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.